It truly is extremely simple. To do a wacky rig right, all you need is a hook and a bait. That's all you need. You don't need any weights. You don't have to have anything else. You can certainly use, the rings that go on those and maybe get a little bit more life out of your baits. Hey everybody, welcome back. We're here in the garage and just wanting to share, some of my favorite soft plastic setups, and one that is definitely a favorite of mine, something that I'll be honest has done really, really well for me, is a wacky rig. Actually, I guess, the first major win I ever had in my fishing career was an Everstart String Series Toyota, whatever you want to call it now. But it was down on Santee Cooper in South Carolina, and in 4 days I had like 94 pounds and something. That was actually one of the first times I'd met Andy Montgomery and been around him very much. He made the top 10 in that one, and he told me to slow down, that I was catching them too fast, that he couldn't keep up, but I didn't take his advice. Anyway, that was one of the first times, my first major win, and I had threw a wacky rig a good bit up to that point, and that would have been in 2008. Is when that was. So a wacky rig is definitely not anything new. It's been around for a really long time, but man, it absolutely still catches them. I really don't understand why. It's just something that's natural, it's subtle, it doesn't have a lot of aggressive action, and it is a fish catcher for me. And it is for almost anybody of any age and any expertise level. Parker, my son, his biggest bass ever, almost an 8-pounder, came on a wacky rig. So maybe maybe the apple didn't fall too far from the tree on his love for wacky rig fishing, but it truly is extremely simple. To do a wacky rig right, all you need is a hook and a bait. That's all you need. You don't need any weights. You don't have to have anything else. You can certainly use, the rings that go on those and maybe get a little bit more life out of your baits, using like those VMC, those crossover pliers and a ring to be able to put that on your bait. But for me personally, wacky rigging most of the time, I don't use it. I just run the hook through the bait and that's it. So for me, the hooks that I use a VMC weedless Neko hook 100% of the time. I don't care if I'm fishing it in basically open water or not, I'm always going to use that weedless hook, because at some point in time during the day, I'm going to get around a piece of cover and I'm going to want that weedlessness of that hook. And it is such a great hook. The weed guards on there aren't stiff enough to keep, I don't feel like I've ever missed a fish due to the weed guards that are on this thing, but I have not gotten hung a lot because of the weed guards that are on this thing. So it really, really works well. For thin-bodied worms, something like a Bass Pro Finneck worm, I'm going to use a number 2 hook most of the time. I'll explain the differences in that, why I don't here in just a second. But for those thin-bodied worms, that little number 2 hook, man, it fits in there really well. It's got plenty of gap, and it's not more hook than what I need for it, okay? So that is the hook that I use for those thin-bodied worms. But then when you step up to a thicker body, something like a Wacky Stik O, something like a regular Bass Pro Stik O, a 4 or 5 inch, I'm going to go up to a number 1 VMC weedless Neko hook to fit those. Those baits are a little bit fatter, and I have on occasion been lazy, put this bait on that number 2 hook and definitely missed fish because of it. Because they will on occasion, you'll have one that'll ball that bait up, and you may get it back and it looks like that, where that fish is actually, wadded the bait up on the hook point. And if you had that on that number 2, you just don't have enough hook there to be able to get it, in the jaw of that fish. Where with that number 1, I've hooked them even though the bait was doubled up like that before. So the exception to that rule, here's a big thing to look at. The number 1 versus the number 2. That number 2 is quite a bit bigger wire, okay? It is a considerably stronger hook than what that number 2 is. That number 2, I've caught some really big fish on it. I've caught 6 or 7 pounders on it on occasion. I actually think Parker's 714 came on a number 2. But if I'm targeting larger fish, like when we fished down at Lake Fork in the spring a couple years ago on the Bass Pro Tour, I was using that exact worm, that pink Finneck worm, twitching it around wacky rigged. I was using that larger number 1 just because of the diameter of the wire, because I knew I was going to catch a number of fish that were 3 to 5 pounds on that worm. And that little number 2 is just a little bit thinner. And those, if you catch a number of fish, you know, in that 4 to 5 pound range, they're going to start to open it up. That number 1, I was fishing it with a 12-pound leader on spinning tackle, and I had no problem whatsoever boat flipping 3.5 pounders. Okay, I wouldn't have done that on the number 2, no question about it. I would have had to, you know, grab every one of those fish. So heavy cover, heavier line situations, I'm going to step up to that number 1 just because of the beefiness of that hook, even when I'm throwing, you know, a thinner bodied worm like that fennec worm. And that pink one, man, that was so much fun in that particular event. That was a really, really fun one for me because it's such a visual bite. I was actually fishing that wacky rigged, but twitching it up high, more like you would a floating worm that's rigged straight, where I could see it almost all the time. And I'd see, you know, 90% of my bites, I'd actually see the fish come up and roll on it when they'd eat it. So just a really fun way to catch them. But yeah, wacky rig has been really, really good to me. It's played a part in several wins, you know, at least in some way or another, and is a fantastic way to catch bass in shallow water. And the deepest I'll typically fish one, just a little tip here to go along with it before we close, but the deepest I'll typically fish a weightless wacky rig, whether that's a Stik O, and I've done it with a worm like that fennec worm. If I've got good still conditions and, you know, not a lot of wind or anything, I don't care at all to fish that 5 or 6 feet deep. That may sound extremely painful, and it can be, but we fished a tournament in New York a few years ago. A lot of fish were spawning in this one particular area, really clear water, but a lot of guys were fishing there. Everybody else was throwing a Stik O style bait, something a little bit heavier, get to the bottom quicker, because it was 4 or 5 feet deep. I was throwing again, a weightless, but a fennec worm type worm, and allowing that thing to just float down into those areas where those fish were. We were all throwing at the same stuff. I had already caught a limit on that and started culling, and the most anybody else had caught in that area was just a couple fish. So there are times where that slower fall of that fennec worm really triggers a lot of bites. So hope this helps you out. Wacky rigs are a lot of fun. A great way to go out and catch some bass, especially in shallow water. I know they've done well for me.